Again, today's lecture is one of 3 lectures that you will need in order to complete exercise 4, which is also being introduced today. We will have a separate PowerPoint to explain exercise 4, and of course exercise 4 is already loaded on Canvas for you. So this graphic should already be familiar to you. This is simply showing how we break parking lots into smaller drainage areas so that we can control where the water goes. What we'll be doing today is talking about how to drop your parking lots so that you have curbs. Those curbs allow you to control where the water flows off of your parking lots into your landscape areas. It is virtually impossible to do an offline system without some way to control where the water flows off of the parking lots. We will again explain offline systems to you in the next lecture, but for now you just need to understand that it is required that you have curbs in order to make these systems work. This graphic should also look familiar to you. This is exercise 3, which you have just completed. The purpose of exercise 3 is simply a mathematical proof that you will use to show that you can fit the required runoff volume that you capture into the bioretention systems that you are going to design. As we said before, it's just mathematical proof. These rectangles that you have at the edge of each of your pavement areas are not the actual shapes for your bioretention systems, but they will give you an indication of how big these are going to need to be. So one of the first things that you'll need to do is make sure that you have a double line to represent the curbs in your parking lot. It's important to understand that this double line is not something that must represent true scale. For example, in the drawing on one side here, we have a double line for a curb that is offset exactly 6 inches to represent the depth of a curb. It's hard to read at this scale. It's hard to see that it's a double line. In the second example, we actually have it offset a full foot. So depending on what scale you're using for your drawing, you need to make this determination early. So whether you're doing a 20 scale, a 30 scale, or a 40 scale drawing, you need to offset your curb. You need to print a sample, just 8.5 by 11, or even on a PDF will work, so that you can see what this will look like in the final drawing. You can even go to a thicker one, as we'll show in the next slide. Here you can see an additional offset. We start on this side, we have the 1 foot offset. On this other drawing, we actually have a 2 foot offset for the curb. Again, remember, this is just a symbol for you to use. A 2 foot offset graphically would probably only be used on a 40 or a 50 scale drawing. You will probably be doing more of a 30 scale drawing, so you might want to stick with the 1 foot offset. Be aware that you do have to have curbs around all of your parking and driving areas. You obviously will not have curbs between your plaza space and the landscape area, but you will have to have curbs between the parking and the plaza space, and we'll be adding ramps later on. Again, all of this is required for us to do exercise 4. So this is a typical parking lot that you might start out with. We're going to use it as an example. As you can see, these are contours, 2% slope, which means, of course, that these contour lines going across the parking lot are 50 feet apart. A thing that I commonly do in AutoCAD to make it simple is I simply go in and I offset 25 feet, both uphill and downhill if need be, from the existing contours. Why 25 feet? Because you know already that at a 2% slope, 1 foot contours are 50 feet apart. Therefore, you also know that half contours would be 25 feet apart. These are 6-inch tall curves, so you know that if I was to take this section here Say this is elevation 12, this is elevation 13. Halfway between will be elevation 12.5. You already know this, so this is the reason that you offset halfway between your existing contours. If your existing contours are something other than 2%, the same idea applies. It's simply that the distance that you offset changes. Remember, the distance will always be half of whatever it is currently between your 1 foot contours. After I offset these contours 25 feet, I will then go and trim them on the inside of the curb, because I know that these contours are going to represent the new contours for the pavement only and not for the landscape area. You may also notice that when I offset these contours, I offset them in a different color. I offset them in blue as opposed to red. That just makes it easier for me to remember what's what as I go forward in the process, as you're going to see in a few minutes. So now that we have trimmed the contours, we've trimmed off the blue contours that were on the outside so that we only represent the blue that are on the pavement. We've trimmed off the red contours, which were the landscape contours that used to run all the way across. So now they only represent the contours that are on the landscape areas. We need to connect these together. So if you were to look at this in a fairly simplistic way, which I really advise you do because this is hard for students to get the very first time they do it. If we go halfway between the 12 and the 13 contours on the landscape area, we know that the elevation right here, halfway between, is going to be 12.5. Because we're using 6-inch curbs, we also know then that this contour is going to be 6 inches below 12.5, which means this is going to be the new 12 contour. We're going to start up here in this corner because it's fairly simple. This contour here is the 14 contour. We know that halfway in between we're at 14.5, so this is going to be our new 14 contour that is on the pavement. To do such, we're going to simply draw this out, and we're going to start down here, and we're just going to run up like this. We know that we have to connect it up to that contour. This is the contour now that's running across the pavement. We run across there, we run along the curb, and then we stop. When we get to where the contour is up on the landscape again, we go across the landscape, we then go up to the contour that's running across the pavement, go across the pavement, come down, and take off on the 14. It's actually that simple. The hardest part is remembering which way you're supposed to go. So let's start again, and we'll do it with the 13 over here. We're going to run the 13 around like this. We're going to run up, and then we know we come across. Now I left the blue one here on the landscape area because it brings up an important point that we need to point out. If we know the elevation right here, the question becomes, which way do we want to go around this landscape island? Do we want to run around the low side, or do you want to run around the high side? The fact is, we know we want to run around the low side because if we look at how the contours come off of the pavement and connect to the landscape area, they always run down the curb to connect to the landscape area. So in this case, you can see we'd want to run down the curb, and it's hard to remember that even when you're going this way, you're running down the curb. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to run down, around, up, over, down, and then connect into the 13. We're going to have the exact same thing when we're doing the 12. Comes up, over, runs around the lower side of the landscape area, comes up, down, and off onto the landscape area. The fact is the 11 stays where it is, and the 15 stays where it is because they're not connecting to the parking lot at all. So that is a very simple way to do something that students often have trouble with. I would advise that you practice this a few times and come back to this lecture and look at this particular slide over and over again, because when you forget which way to go, this slide will help you out. So after you go back and clean up your drawing, you should get something that looks like this. It's important when you're doing this to relabel the contours again inside the parking lot so that the builder and we understand that you have this correctly figured out. If you do not have these labeled on the inside of the parking lot, we're not sure that you've got them correct. So You need to label all the contours inside the parking lot as well as out on the landscape area. The other thing I want to point out is I put in this 50-foot spacing here because it's important to check to see if is there any chance that this 11 contour might have a little bitty closed contour down here. That's always an option, and you want to just be aware of it as an option. So what happens is if it's there, it'll just come across very small and reattach. In this case, it doesn't because we have that 50 foot, and if we were to offset 50 feet, we'd actually see that that is not an issue, but I just want you to be aware of that as you move forward in this process, because on many of your drawings, you will find that you have this little closed contour down there, and we don't want you to forget it. And of course, we'll help you find it as we go through the reviews. So that's a quick lecture of how you're going to drop your parking lot and move your contours so that they are correct. Again, go back through and take a look at a few of these. You're going to need this for exercise 4, and there'll be an additional video that you can look at to get exercise 4 explained, although most of it is pretty self-explanatory on Canvas. Remember, you still have 2 more lectures that you have to look at: offline versus online retention and grading the retention systems as part of this assignment. You will, however, need to have your parking lots dropped and your contours correct before you come to the first set of review sessions.